Okay, perfect. So it's November 12th, 2025, and I'm so happy to be here with Kari Ferrell. My name is Wyatt Lim Teper. I'm the founder and president of a nonprofit organization, A Curiae, and I'm honored to be here today with Kari Ferrell, who's an entertainer, author, and much more to talk about her book, You'll Never Believe Me, and her experience in reentry. So to get started, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me, Kari.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited about this conversation. I very much appreciate and support the work that A Curiae does.
Great. Thanks so much, Carrie. Carrie's a producer, writer, speaker, activist, and creator. Her work is centered around incarceration in the justice system, mental health, human rights, adoption, and other issues she feels passionately about. Carrie's production company, Without Wax, is dedicated to uplifting and telling women of color's stories across a variety of mediums. Every project that she works on is done with the mission of moving the needle forward toward a more compassionate society and proving that change is possible. So, to get started, Carrie, congrats so much on the success of your book. Why don't we start off by just telling us a bit about your inspiration and process for writing the story?
Yeah, so I have a pretty wild life story. I was adopted into a Mormon family, so from South Korea, and grew up within the LDS church. And I just did not have a sense of identity. To be honest, I was the only person who looked like me. I just didn't know where I fit in. I had a great childhood. My parents provided for me in every way that they could and that they knew how. And this was the 90s, so there wasn't as much information as there is out there in the world. But I didn't know who I was. And due to that and many other things and just my poor judgment, I ended up getting into trouble with the law. This was in my late teen, early 20s. I was still just acting impulsively and not really thinking about the repercussions of my actions. It wasn't necessarily that I was plotting or meaning to harm people, but that is what happened. So I ended up writing bad checks to friends that would bounce. So I essentially ran myself out of Utah and moved to New York City. My story was one of the first internet scam stories. And so this was prior to Instagram. We really only had Twitter. That was like the introduction,
Right.
MySpace into social media. And it was really the first viral grifter story. And so the news cycle was a lot slower then as well. And it
Yeah.
just stuck. And a lot of the story was around my race. It was very gendered, and it was either look at this seemingly subservient Asian girl or look at the crazy dragon lady. And so I continued to struggle with identity, and I ultimately continued my criminal activity in New York. Ultimately, the story popped off, and I knew that I had to, if I wanted any semblance of a life that
Sure.
wasn't always looking over my shoulder, I needed to do something about it. And so I ultimately ended up turning myself in Philadelphia.
Right. So we'll break down some of these components of your book that you talk about in such amazing detail. But before we get into kind of the quotes and kind of the things that I loved about your book, tell us a little bit just like your writing process and kind of what was the, it'd be great to tell my story. And I think people would be interested. And this is an opportunity to kind of be the entertainer, the creator, the author that I've wanted to be.
Yeah, thank you for steering me back to your original question. I honestly, 2020 happened. After I got out of jail, I wanted to fade into obscurity. And so I joined corporate America and was a digital marketing director for quite a few years.
Yeah.
And I do have felonies on my record. No more, they've been expunged. And so I had all of these great jobs, been a good employee, but then they would find out who I am slash was by Googling me. And there would be a day where they would call me into HR and tell me, hey, we found this thing out about your past. You're a great employee, but this affects our relationships with our clients. When 2020 came around, obviously life changed for everyone. but I felt extremely activated when it came to just the Black Lives Matter
Sure.
movement, the just racism that Asian Asians and Asian Americans were experiencing on a day to day. So I realized that I had a lot to say
Yeah.
around these things, and that maybe with my different viewpoints and approach and humor, that people would maybe want to listen. And they did. So I did that just like through Instagram for a while, posting my own stories, doing Q&As, and people responded to it really well. And so people were starting to spread my story in that way, which was really interesting for me because the media spread their own version of the story nearly 20 years ago. And here it is that my story is being spread based off of things that I've said. And so it really felt like reclaiming the narrative.
Great.
And it was at that time where I was like, okay, I think I have enough traction and confidence that this could be a thing. And so I went to my friend's agent. I was lucky to have that, and we talked about it, and they said, yeah, I think this is a great story, great idea. Let's see what we can do. And I was a writer before. That's really how my whole journey in New York City started, is that I was trying to be a writer on
Mhm.
staff somewhere. So it really came full circle. In the writing process, there were days that I would write for hours and it just seemed to flow. More often than not, though, it was like slamming my head on the keyboard,
Great.
powering through. But it was so cathartic. And I knew that even if something didn't happen with it, that I needed to have this documentation. And it's called You'll Never Believe Me for a reason. It is because I was known as a liar, but it's also because it's very much from my perspective. I think that if you talked to my victims, and I've been fortunate enough that some of them have reached out to me and we have a friendship again, which
Wow.
is just a testament to people's to the grace that they're extending me, but also in their ability to see that it was a series of poor decisions that I am doing everything I can to correct. One of those people reached out to me and they said, this is what you should have been doing with your amazing natural storytelling ability the
Yeah.
entire time. And that just meant so much to me. That means a lot to me, just full stop. But then
Yeah.
it coming from someone who I ultimately intentionally harmed just to be seen like that, I really am so grateful that they reached out. But I've been
Yeah.
getting a lot of things like that, just people connecting with my story. And that is so amazing,
Right. I
so
mean, giving
incredible.
goosebumps, just kind of like that restorative component of taking accountability for harm that you've experienced. 20 years is also a long time, and there's possibility to grow over that time and rekindle and rebuild relationships, which is so hard, but so powerful when it
Ah,
can be done. And so, some things I love about your book are just the honesty about discovering yourself, how you reflect on your life and your experience, and being really purposeful with your relationships. If I could just quote part of your book, and we'll do this a couple times, but you say, my own Han had come through the loss of people I thought I loved but would never actually meet. I realized that not knowing is worse than not being, so I started to dive into my culture as much as I'd permit myself. But as interested as I was, I also didn't believe that I was allowed to feel annoyed or jilted or wronged because I had inflicted the same thing upon so many others. Han is complicated and tricky, there to comfort you on occasion and crucify you the next. So I thought that quote really just showed the dynamic of being pulled in so many different ways. And I know your experience being adopted, being the only person that looked like you where you grew up, and kind of just feeling this pull of not feeling like you're belonging. So maybe you could just start off by telling us a little bit about Han and how it relates to you. And then the bigger question is going to be, what was the turning point to grant yourself permission to look at yourself and the consequences of looking at yourself?
ooh, easy question. So I'll start with pawn. Pawn is a concept that's really a concept of an emotion that is shared by many South Koreans. And it is a sort of postmodern concept that comes from the Japanese occupation of Korea. Han is a term that captures something of the modern experience of Koreans, and it's almost any negative emotion can be called Han, but it's specific to the central aspect of a loss of identity, the complex of emotions that results from the traumatic loss of collective identity. And so when I read that, I was just like, this is what I've been feeling. This loss of identity that I didn't realize was collective. And so it's interesting because part of Han is resilience, right? But it's also kind of being deeply entrenched in your own, I don't want to say self pity, but you're very trapped within yourself.
Right.
And so I started reading more about Han and connecting to it. And that, like in the quote that you read, is really what prompted me to start looking into my heritage and who I am. And that's really what allowed me to start exploring myself and my own issues. Because I read all of these accounts of people experiencing their own version of Han and seeing, well, the point isn't the severity of what you've done. The point is, again, the resilience and the overcoming or the acceptance of that thing. And I had started to take accountability years prior, but not necessarily in that self-healing way. I had started to get into activism and mutual aid and things like that, actively trying to make the world a better place day to day with direct action. But it wasn't until, yeah, I read about Han that I was like, okay, my experience is a relatable one. I took it to the nth degree, but everyone knows what it feels like to feel guilty, for what it feels like to be waiting to be caught, for the other shoe to drop. Yeah, the fact that of it being 2020, I was just like, all right, now is the time to reclaim my narrative and to the best of my ability and hopefully educate people through entertainment, make them laugh, make
Yeah.
them maybe cry, but at the very least, make them think about how we treat people in our society who have made poor decisions.
Right. And I think just to kind of share our experience in working with the reentry population, right? And unfortunately, many people who are involved in the justice system have horribly traumatic experiences. And one of the most powerful things I think that people can do is dig into themselves, right? And that's one of the scariest and hardest things to do. We see it very often with our clients who have substance use disorder, where it's very
Mhm.
rare for people to just wake up and say, I'm going to be addicted to heroin for the rest of my life, right? It's usually a lot of experiences, a lot of negative and traumatic experiences that lead to not wanting to feel. But going home at the end of the day to look at yourself and process what you've been through to build, grow, become accountable, and ultimately give back is the hard work that we often talk about in the reentry population. So powerful and courageous to really kind of go through all of that to get to a place where I think you are, right? I think in past conversations, we've talked about how it's not just forgetting about the negative experiences, right? It's kind of encompassing your negative experiences to learn to grow, because that's the important aspect of processing how you can move forward.
Exactly. And I also think that our society, we just kind of assume that everyone is good, bad, born good, turned bad, whatever. To me, it's good decisions and poor decisions. Some people really only know how to make poor decisions. I think just in the same ways that most people are taught to make good ones, it doesn't always happen that way. And so we need to be a little more flexible in the way that we look at these kinds of ideologies.
Right.
People need to be taught how to make the right decision. And
Right.
I was one of those people. I still continue to be one of those people. But similarly to what you're saying, I don't feel like the negative experiences were worthless. They are certainly the most painful and the hardest to sort of reckon with. And I don't even want to say that I've fully forgiven myself. That's a part of this journey that I hope to achieve. I don't know that I will, to be honest,
Yeah.
but I care about being a fulfilled person.
Yeah.
And so I'm just trying to do what I can to make that come to fruition. And again, why I appreciate what you're doing, bridging the gap. There were so many instances when I was incarcerated where, again, I was very privileged and lucky in that I was able to hire an attorney, that I was able to have this support system. And obviously, I saw so many people who don't have those things. There was so much potential there. People have the capacity to do anything that they want. But again, when we let people out with no resources and we're charging them money for things, whether that be drug tests, or Utah is a pay to stay state. So I actually ended up owing for the time that I was incarcerated, which is also nuts because they're making money from the government, these privately owned institutions, for each person who's incarcerated. So a lot of it is just, yeah, finding these amazing organizations that are approaching these very systemic issues in creative, unique, and different angles. The judicial system doesn't have to be the enemy. They're not supposed to be the enemy. They're supposed to be neither nor, but they could also be the ones that can actually actively help change lives for the better.
Right, right. Just kind of like you
Um,
mentioned throughout your book, right? You're waiting for the shoe to drop and kind of this sense of relief to not be hiding, right? And being able to kind of address the problem head on. And it kind of moves us into our next topic where it's, hey, you need to find a job before you're violated. You need to work before to pay your restitution, but only find jobs with criminal background friendly employers that pay not as much as a private corporation, or you jeopardize those things. And so one thing that we do at Curiae is we work with clients in addressing their criminal past on job interviews and having them work with mentors. And you write about the underlying fear of being fired at any point. And so, to give another quote, you say, all of this went through my head almost every minute of every day. Whenever my boss called me, my heart dropped, and I would think, this is it. But most of the time, it wasn't. She was simply asking the results of a double-blind study or wondering where her lunch was. It all felt very reminiscent of when I was incarcerated and waiting to see the judge. Not knowing if the next day I'd still be in jail was kind of like not knowing if I'd have a job. But hadn't I paid the price? Hadn't I done my time? How was it fair that something that defined a person a decade ago could allow them around like Peter Pan's effed up shadow? It was a hard life to live, with the lies you told years ago begetting more lies in present day. So it's just really just fascinating and just take a moment to imagine that, right? Like going to work every day and not being sure if you would make it through the end of the day and kind of this edge that you feel. And so, how did you kind of get past the acceptance to just be a professional, right? To show your work, to show an organization that you were a great employee that just so happened to have a background?
yeah, I'm very grateful. I don't mention them by name, but I do write about the company and my coworkers at the last corporate company that I worked for, because they were aware of most of the situation. To be honest, they I don't want to say they didn't care, but they didn't care in the appropriate ways of like, we feel like we can trust you. We're not, they didn't even say we're going to give you a chance, but like they during our interview talked about some reentry programs that the marketing director had done on her own. And that was just a stroke of luck, honestly, that this was a person who had an invested interest in reentry and
Yeah.
helping formerly incarcerated people. So I really lucked out on that one. But prior to that, at these other jobs, I mean, yeah, it was, well, what else can I do? It's like I will be the best employee that I can be until I can't anymore, whether that's because I'm leaving on my own volition, because I got a better job, or I'm doing something different, or they let me go. Either way, I have no idea what that timeline looks like. So I just need to be moving forward as if that is all there is to do. It's so unfair the way that we go about trying to reform people. It's like an order of operations issue. There are so many people that I met while incarcerated where I am like, oh my God, if they had just had the opportunity to like get an MBA, they could have been CEO, Fortune 500 easily, easily. It's like people don't take into account, first of all, like what we refer to as soft skills, right? Just your
Right?
ability to communicate with people, your ability to like just be the person you are. We always want these hard skills like that you can get certificates for
Or
and
forklift operator, right?
yeah, or things like that. And it's like the people I met who were drug runners or whatever it was, I'm like, your business acumen is insane. It is off the charts.
Right.
Like, yeah, you were transporting or dealing in things that you shouldn't have been, but imagine if that were like regular, if those were toys coming from
Yeah.
another part of the country or like shipping cargo. It's just like I very much believe in transferable skills.
Right.
And people, even if they think that they don't have any skills, they definitely do. So I left that company and started my own production company. And I feel very similarly the way that I operate in that as well, which is just keeping my goals in mind, but utilizing the skills that I have. I try not to dwell on how I gained them, but that I
Yeah.
have them. And it's my responsibility to use them ethically, but that they can easily be transferred into really any kind of job.
Yeah.
And I think using stories like mine, like others, and what you do in helping them to talk about it is so important because, first of all, it humanizes us. It
Right.
humanizes people who have been through things that people, others may just see as like, honestly, just criminals. Like
Dismiss
sometimes you
them.
don't
Right.
shake it, like even if you have done all the things, like in that passage that you read. So once they hear you speaking to it and you can really show that you are moving past that and that this company honestly has an opportunity to help you in that journey, that can be very powerful and positive.
Yeah.
So
Completely. I mean, you bring up so many great points where in our core programs, right, we talk about all the time where if client A went to Stanford, they'd be graduating top of their class at an MBA, right? And it was just opportunity to education, social connection, whatever it may have been. These are people filled with immense talent. And to kind of point again to kind of like the challenges reentry, right? I think so many clients who are coming out of incarceration who have skills, who may have college degrees, but now have to get past this barrier of finding gainful employment expectation that they put on themselves, right? Like, even if they
mhm.
landed a job, right? I'm lucky to just have a job as a formerly incarcerated person. I need to be perfect at everything we do and no one is perfect at their job, right? And it's the small things, the soft skills of finding the courage and confidence to ask for a raise in your yearly evaluation or to put up your professional boundaries when you're double booked for a meeting to politely say, hey, I'm sorry, I can't make it. Let's find another time on our calendar. So these are the small things that part of it is maturing and gaining more professional growth, but it takes resiliency, it takes time, it takes patience from who you're working with. But some of our clients can be the best possible workers and extremely dedicated to growing companies and organizations.
For sure. And I think when you give someone that opportunity from a company, from an organization's perspective, they can be fiercely loyal. Know your value, right? Don't let yourself be taken advantage of, because that for me is one of the biggest barriers, is my trying to forgive myself for what I've done. And that's something that I'm still working on and maybe working on forever, which again is why I look at, well, am I a fulfilled person? Because it is so hard to think, oh, I don't deserve this, or I have to do this thing to sort of penance for crimes that I've committed, or just ways that I've treated people.
Yeah,
Like it's the white knight syndrome of a lot of people who are formerly incarcerated. They then just want to save everyone, which
sure.
makes sense, especially because our society is not necessarily doing it. And yeah, it's so just disproportionately unfair. And so anything that can be done that brings light to that and then actively is changing that is so amazing.
Absolutely. One part of your book that I was very curious and pretty entertained about, to be honest, was you mentioned it earlier where you turned yourself in Philadelphia and had to come back to Utah and kind of your experience with law enforcement. And so one thing you mentioned in the book was, I don't know whom I was expecting to pick me up, but it wasn't these two. They were so non-threatening, nice almost. Was this exciting for them? Had they done this before? I had questions, but bit my tongue. There would be plenty of time to talk. And so this was, I think, around your experience being on an airplane, having to use the bathroom, getting a few treats, making conversation with these detectives. Can you just talk a little bit about your experience with law enforcement and how this resulting curiosity, the impact that it had on you?
Yeah, so this is when I was being extradited from Philadelphia to Salt Lake. And I mean, I was basically Con Aired, right? Like handcuffed on a plane. But unlike the film Con Air, it wasn't a plane only of incarcerated people.
Yeah.
It was a regular domestic flight. And I remember, yeah, when they came to pick me up, they were plain clothes, first of all. So they didn't have that like immediate air of, I don't know, just like to me, subjugation. But they came in and they were very respectful of me in general. But yeah, we had to go to the airport and I they gave me this like massive 90s like neon colored windbreaker that had a hole cut in the pocket so that I could remain cuffed but just look like my hands were in the
Wow.
like kangaroo pocket. And yeah, so that's how we waited in the waiting area for the plane to board. I had to go to the bathroom, so the female detective went with me. I was just chit-chatting. I mean, I'm a yapper, obviously, as you can tell. And even though they represented something that I had started to become resentful, and I believe in a future without prisons and systems of incarceration, but I'm also very pragmatic and a realist. And I know that those things are not going to change overnight. We have to have a society that's set up and ready to support those kinds of honestly ambitious, positive world change. So I was just so interested in what they were experiencing. Again, I was like, I wonder if they've done this before. I wonder if this is weird to them too, or if they're nervous about like what could go wrong, or are they nervous flyers? One of them ended up being a nervous flyer. One of them had got me a soda and Starburst. And I remember they were like, you can't have them until we get on the plane. I'm on the plane in the middle of these two detectives, and one of them is literally individually unwrapping these starbursts for me and like putting them in my mouth. And so in speaking with these detectives, I mean, it was all very respectful, but there were things that I was sort of throughout the flight, I had got comfortable enough to sort of challenge, maybe that's not the right word, but discuss with them like differing thoughts. If I'm ever a demonstration or something where we're talking about just systemic, the police forces and some of the reasoning behind the way that we feel with our ideologies, it is like people are like, well, not all cops, right?
Yeah.
And it's more about that they're supporting this institution, right? By being employed. It's not actually that every single one of these people are narcissistic and selfish and nefarious. And so that I think about those detectives a lot in my work. I mean, my case was pretty open and shut because I turned myself in. And I
Right.
think the state of Utah kind of felt like they would look silly if they didn't come to get me. Because
Hmm.
I do wonder, I'm like, how much money did they spend for these two people to come and versus how much my crime was actually quote unquote worth? But for whatever the case, this is a person who these are people who did seem to have my general best interest in mind. And yeah, I think about them. I disagree. I know that they are still within the institution, but detectives are, in my mind, and this is the thing I'm sure that you see in your work, that different people have different places within a very large system.
Right.
And so it's all interwoven and connected. And I think that we need to acknowledge that. And you can't have one without the other, but that means that you also can't get rid of one thing without the other,
Right.
whether that's support or whether that's like eradication. Yeah, so those detectives, I complicated feelings to be honest around them.
Well, I think it brings up just a really fascinating kind of thought challenge, right? Where it's how do we look at large systems? And any large system is going to have its flaws, but how do we kind of give these individualized experiences to kind of have a step in the direction for positivity, right? So this kind of, I'm sorry to put words in your mouth and totally correct me
No,
if I'm doing it wrong, but it at least just made you think a little bit differently about what law enforcement could be. And it's similar when a client appears in front of a judge. Judges are known to sentence people and sentence people oftentimes for lengthy amounts of time that really impact and change people's lives. Judges can also have the influence to say, "Hi, Carrie, how are you doing?" Right? And show
yeah,
a person in power to have an impact and just kind of build a type of connection that can be the motivation to be impactful in the community and make a change and be accountable for what they want to do. And so it kind of leads us into kind of our closing couple topics, right? Where we're doing all this work in the reentry space and doing all this great entertainment work, but where do you kind of see your professional goals and what you want to accomplish in the reentry space?
ultimately I would love to somehow have an impact on legislation. I really believe in, and I may have mentioned this already, but education through entertainment. I think that's really how we connect with people, especially now that so many people get their information from social media. If through a piece of art or a movie or a TV show, you see something that connects with you on an emotional level, that's really how people start to absorb. My goal is to, with every project, that I take on, it needs to align to my values and principles, and it needs to be saying something, and it needs to be real. And so, even though it's like dark comedy and it's ridiculousness and salacious at times, it is very much bringing light to these issues. And I really want to focus on telling other queer women of color's stories because there are so many out there and who have just as crazy, just as wild, just as amazing, beautiful stories as my own is. Just really, I mean, it's such a overused answer of trying to make the world a better place, but
Sure.
it's trying to give a little bit of direction on how to make the world a better place. And really, that's like community. It is, we're lucky to live in metropolitan cities where we're basically living on top of each other because that means when you walk outside or just even within your apartment building, you have community, even
Right.
if that's just identifying as like a city dweller.
Hmm.
But in some areas, in a lot of areas, that might not be as visible. It definitely can exist. So many mutual aid organizations everywhere, but it's harder for people to find them.
Yeah.
So letting people know that they exist and that there's a lot of different ways that activism and advocacy can look. It doesn't have to be boots on the ground. Though that being said, that's again how you get to know your people and your community. And we really have to rely on one another, especially now, and especially within the incarceration, just within the yeah, prison industrial complex, because again, people are being let out with nothing and then being held to impossible standards. And then it's like, then they get further punished for not being able to hold it together. When realistically, it's like, no, they were set up to fail. This was never constructed to really help them. Or if it was at one point, it has mutated into something that no longer does. And that's not to say that there aren't amazing like programs within some of these institutions. Like I looking at Pause for Change, where they do the dog training
Yeah.
with the inmates and then they get adopted out. And that's just so beneficial and beautiful and such an amazing teaching moment. We should have more of those programs.
I always joke, right? There could be 20 other organizations that are doing similar work and it's not enough. And there's so much to
Yep.
do. And I think there's so much evidence-based interventions and best practices that we can now
Mm-hmm.
follow where kind of what you're describing, this concept of social connection, like isolation is a true public health crisis, right? I think it's equated to smoking 15 cigarettes a day if you're not meeting your needs for being connected. So it's so powerful. And thank you again just for writing your story, right? You'll Never Believe Me is wonderful. You laugh, you
Thank you.
cry, you want to share it with everyone that you meet. I was at the library with my daughter and we saw your book and it was like, hey, let's pick it up, and reached out to you on your website. And just thank you again for being so available to kind of talk about your work, your values, and everything that we do with the organization. You can check out Kari's work, her entertainment company at madewithoutwax.com, where she's sharing, and hopefully she has some really great things to share in the new year in 2026. But to close out, Kari, is there any final thoughts or things you want to share, promote, or ideas?
I mean, I think the biggest thing again is just people ask me, well, how do you keep your head up when the world is the way that it is, when your own feelings about yourself are the way that they are or can be? Because it's a roller coaster, and it's a roller coaster that sometimes you can't necessarily get off of. And so it is just channeling again that energy and finding productive things to put it toward, but also by being involved in my communities, I see people helping one another, actively helping one another every single day. And that is like direct action. It's do people are looking for coats. Okay, done. We have 20 of them in an hour. Just seeing things like that, that's really what brings me hope. The news, the government, they would love to have you believe otherwise, right? But no, there we are all taking care of one another. And I just would love for more people to not only see that, but become activated by it. Because like you said, not only is your ability to sit with what you've done with other people too, talking to other people, like that is how you heal trauma. That is the number one, I mean, scientifically proven way to retrain some of these like neural pathways that trauma can cause. And it is literally by just being around people,
Yep.
not even necessarily talking about those things. It's just being around people.
Right.
And so I encourage, sometimes it's, and I'm not saying you have to be out and about every single day. It's
Yeah.
just talking to people, and this is how ideas are shared. And I'm so glad that you reached out. Also, shout out to the libraries out
Yeah.
there. Love
Go
the
public libraries.
library. Yeah. And just like being intentional with the way that you are consuming things, whether that be social media, the news, how your what companies you're supporting as you're getting your coffee or whatever. And that's not to say that you should position yourself where you're like going to feel bad about something or can or will not. It's more of just being living with intention and integrity, which is so important for people who are formerly incarcerated, because so much of the going to jail process is trying to break that
Mhm.
integrity that you might have toward other parts of your life. And it's like, okay, how do we retool it so that you are feeling those ways and that drive toward your own personal growth?
Yeah.
And that can be very difficult. So there are a lot of resources out there. Utilize them. You are one of them.
Hoping to be. That's amazing. So, Carrie, thanks so much. We've heard it from Carrie, right? Be purposeful, be connected. It's how things get better. So, Carrie, thank you so much for your time and sharing your interview. It's wonderful to chat.
It's so nice to chat. And also, people, please make sure you support organizations like A Curiae because, yeah, that's exactly who and what we need in this world, especially within this particular landscape.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Carrie.
So donate, everyone, donate.